The year 1066 is a date that every schoolchild in Britain learns. It is etched into our national memory, a turning point that fundamentally reshaped the course of English history, language and culture. On a single, bloody day in October, the fate of a kingdom was decided on a grassy hill in Sussex. This was the Battle of Hastings, a brutal and grueling clash that saw the Anglo-Saxon way of life come to a violent end, replaced by the iron fist of Norman rule. It was more than just a battle, it was the dramatic final act in a complex story of power, ambition, and a contested throne. The outcome of this fight would echo for centuries, its consequences still visible in the castles that dot our landscape and the words we speak every day. But what if the story we've always been told isn't the whole truth? What if this famous battle was built on a foundation of deception? History is often written by the victors, and the tale of Hastings is a prime example. The Normans, led by William the Conqueror, were masters of propaganda. They wanted to present their invasion not as a greedy land grab, but as a righteous quest to claim what was rightfully theirs. This essay will journey back to that fateful year, exploring the events that led to the confrontation and the blow-by-blow account of the battle itself. We will peel back the layers of the official narrative to uncover the whispers of betrayal and broken promises. We will investigate the claims that the battle was in some ways a fraud. This doesn't mean the fighting wasn't real. The courage and suffering on both sides were immense. Instead, it refers to the moral and political trickery that may have set the stage for the conflict. Did the English king, Harold Godwinson, truly break a sacred oath? Was the Norman victory a result of clever, perhaps even dishonorable tactics? By looking at the story from both the Norman and the English perspective, we can begin to understand the complexities behind this legendary event. It's a detective story set in the 11th century, and the clues are hidden in chronicles, tapestries, and the very ground where the soldiers fell. Ultimately, the Battle of Hastings is a powerful lesson in how history is constructed. It teaches us to question the stories we hear and to look for the voices that have been silenced. For young people today, it's a reminder that events of the distant past are not just dusty facts in a textbook. They are dramatic human stories filled with intrigue, conflict, and controversy. Understanding Hastings is understanding how our world was shaped, but it is also about learning to think critically about the past, to separate fact from fiction, and to appreciate that the truth is often much more complicated and interesting than it first appears. Let us now turn to the key players in this epic drama. The stage for the Battle of Hastings was set long before the armies clashed. The story begins with a crisis of succession. In January 1066, the King of England, Edward the Confessor, died without a child to inherit his throne. This created a power vacuum, a dangerous situation where the crown was suddenly available to the most powerful and ambitious men in Northern Europe. Three main claimants emerged, each with a different reason for believing they were the rightful king. Their competing ambitions would plunge England into a year of bloodshed and turmoil, culminating in the decisive battle that would change everything. The question of who should rule was not just a political debate. It was a matter that would be settled with swords and axes. The first claimant was Harold Godwinson, the most powerful and influential nobleman in England. As the Earl of Wessex, he was incredibly wealthy, a seasoned military commander and the brother-in-law of the late King Edward. On his deathbed, Edward supposedly named Harold as his successor. The Witan, a council of England's leading nobles and clergymen, quickly confirmed this choice and crowned Harold king just one day after Edward's death. From the English perspective, this was a legitimate and sensible decision. Harold was one of their own, a proven leader who understood the kingdom and had the support of its most important figures. He was the man on the spot, ready to defend England from any threat. However, across the English Channel in Normandy, another powerful ruler had a very different view. William, the Duke of Normandy, claimed that the English throne had been promised to him years earlier. According to Norman accounts, King Edward, who had spent much of his youth in exile in Normandy, had designated William as his heir. More importantly, the Normans claimed that Harold Godwinson himself had sworn a sacred oath on holy relics to support William's claim. This alleged oath took place when Harold was shipwrecked on the Norman coast a few years before. Whether this oath truly happened, or if Harold was forced into it, became the central piece of William's justification for war. He branded Harold an oath-breaker, a usurper who had defied God's will. The third contender came from the north. Harald Hardrada, the fearsome king of Norway, was a legendary Viking warrior who had fought and plundered his way across the known world from Russia to Constantinople. His claim to the English throne was more tenuous, based on an old agreement between previous Viking and English kings. Hardrada saw the chaos in England as a golden opportunity to restore a great Scandinavian empire in the north. He formed an alliance with Tostig Godwinson, Harold of England's own estranged and vengeful brother. Together they assembled a massive Viking fleet and prepared to invade from the north, adding another deadly dimension to the struggle for the English crown. England was now trapped between two powerful invaders. As the summer of 1066 wore on, England held its breath. King Harold Godwinson knew that invasions were coming, but he didn't know from where or when. He assembled the Fyrd, the English national army composed of his professional soldiers and peasant levies, and positioned them along the southern coast. For months they waited for William's fleet to sail from Normandy, but the winds were against the Normans, keeping their ships pinned in port. Meanwhile, Harold's army was running out of supplies and morale. The men were farmers who needed to return home for the harvest. In early September, with no sign of William, Harold made the difficult decision to disband his southern army. It was a calculated risk that would have disastrous consequences. Just as Harold disbanded his forces, news arrived from the north. Harold Hardrada and Tostig Godwinson had landed with their vast Viking army. They had sailed up the River Humber and were marching towards the city of York, the most important city in northern England. Harold had to act fast. He hastily reassembled his elite troops, his housecarls, and began a remarkable forced march north. His army covered nearly 200 miles in just 4 days, a stunning feat of speed and endurance. They caught the Viking army completely by surprise at a place called Stamford Bridge on September 25th. The Vikings were so confident they had left much of their armor behind with their ships. The Battle of Stamford Bridge was a brutal and decisive victory for the English. King Harold Godwinson fought with incredible skill and ferocity. The battle was legendary, with tales of a single giant Viking holding a narrow bridge against the entire English army until he was finally brought down. In the end, both Harold Hardrada and Tostig Godwinson were killed, and the Viking army was annihilated. Of the 300 ships that had brought them to England, fewer than 25 were needed to carry the survivors home. It was one of the greatest victories in English military history. Harold had successfully defended his kingdom and eliminated one of the 3 claimants to the throne. But his triumph would be tragically short-lived. Just 3 days after his stunning victory at Stamford Bridge, as Harold and his exhausted army were resting in York, he received the news he had been dreading all summer. William of Normandy had finally landed. The winds had changed, and the Norman fleet had crossed the Channel unopposed, landing at Pevensey on the south coast on September 28. Harold's exhausted army now had to turn around and march another 250 miles south to face a fresh, well-equipped and rested Norman force. The timing could not have been worse. The hero of Stamford Bridge now faced an even greater challenge, with a weary army and the fate of his kingdom hanging in the balance. After another grueling march south, King Harold and his English army arrived near the Norman landing site. Harold chose his ground carefully. He positioned his forces atop a ridge known today as Senlac Hill, about 7 miles from the town of Hastings. This was a superb defensive position. The steep slopes of the hill would make it difficult for the Norman cavalry to charge effectively, forcing them to attack uphill and tiring them out before they even reached the English lines. Harold's plan was simple but effective. He would form his men into a shield wall, a classic Anglo-Saxon tactic. This involved soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder, their round shields interlocked to create a solid, almost impenetrable barrier of wood and steel. The English army was composed of 2 main types of soldiers. At its core were the housecarls, Harold's elite professional warriors. These were formidable fighters, heavily armed with mail armor, helmets, and their terrifying weapon of choice, the great 2-handed Dane axe. A single blow from a Dane axe could slice through a shield, a helmet, or even a horse. Supporting the housecarls was the Fyrd, the militia made up of farmers and landowners who were called to fight for the king in times of war. While less well-equipped than the housecarls, they were motivated and fighting to defend their own homes and land. Together they formed a disciplined and determined line that stretched across the top of the ridge. On the morning of October 14th, 1066, the Norman army advanced to the base of the hill. William's force was very different from the English army. It was a modern, continental-style army composed of three distinct elements: archers, infantry, and most importantly, heavy cavalry. The knights, clad in mail and armed with lances and swords, were the shock troops of the Norman army. William's plan was to first weaken the English shield wall with a barrage of arrows from his archers. Then his infantry would advance up the slope to engage the English in close-quarters combat. Finally, he would send in his knights to charge and shatter the weakened English line. It was a classic combined arms strategy that had proven successful in many European battles. The battle began around 9 in the morning. The Norman archers let loose a volley of arrows, but they had little effect. Because they were firing uphill, most of the arrows either flew over the heads of the English or embedded harmlessly in their shields. Next, the Norman infantry charged up the slope, only to be met by a hail of spears, axes and stones from the English above them. They clashed with the shield wall, but could not break through. The English line held firm, repelling the attack with brutal efficiency. The screams of men and the clang of steel on steel filled the air, but the wall of shields remained solid and unbroken. For hours the battle raged with incredible ferocity. William the Conqueror threw his forces against the English shield wall again and again, but each assault was beaten back. The Norman infantry and cavalry charged up the steep slope, only to be repulsed by the disciplined English defenders. The ground at the foot of the hill became littered with the bodies of men and horses. The English line, though under immense pressure, held its ground. The Dane axes of the housecarls swung relentlessly, causing horrific injuries and striking fear into the hearts of the Norman attackers. It seemed as though Harold's defensive strategy was working perfectly. The Normans were becoming demoralized and their attacks were losing their momentum. At a critical moment in the battle, a rumor swept through the Norman ranks: William was dead. Panic began to set in. The Breton division on the Norman left flank broke and fled down the hill. Seeing their enemies run, a large group of inexperienced English feared men on the right flank broke their discipline. Against orders, they broke from the safety of the shield wall and charged down the hill in pursuit of the fleeing Bretons. This was a disastrous mistake. Harold had commanded his men to hold the high ground at all costs, knowing that their strength lay in their defensive formation. The undisciplined charge exposed them and created a gap in the English line. Seeing the chaos, William acted decisively to turn the situation to his advantage. He rode into the midst of his panicking troops, pushing up his helmet to show his face and shouting that he was still alive. His presence rallied his men and restored their courage. He then led a counterattack against the English, who had foolishly charged down the hill. Caught on open level ground and out of formation, the English were no match for the Norman knights, and they were quickly surrounded and cut to pieces. The Normans had not only survived a moment of crisis, but had also learned a valuable lesson about their enemy's weakness. The English could be tempted to break their ranks. This is where the story of deception truly takes hold. According to Norman chroniclers, William turned this accidental discovery into a deliberate tactic. He ordered his knights to stage a series of, feigned retreats. The knights would charge up the hill, engage the shield wall briefly, and then pretend to panic and flee. The trick was designed to lure more of the English defenders off the high ground and into the open, just as the first group had been. It was a risky but brilliant strategy. Each time the Normans pretended to flee, some of the English, eager for victory, would break formation and give chase. And each time the Norman knights would turn on their pursuers and destroy them, gradually weakening the formidable shield wall. As the day wore on, the battle became a brutal war of attrition. The feigned retreats, whether a deliberate strategy or a series of fortunate accidents, had taken their toll on the English army. The shield wall was still holding, but it was smaller and weaker than it had been in the morning. The ground was slick with blood, and the remaining defenders were exhausted, having fought continuously for over 8 hours. Yet, as long as King Harold was alive and fighting at the center of his line, the English spirit remained unbroken. His presence was a source of inspiration, his banner a rallying point for his weary but determined soldiers. The outcome of the battle still hung in the balance. As dusk began to fall, William ordered his archers to try a new tactic. Instead of firing directly at the shield wall, which had proven ineffective, he told them to arc their shots high into the air. The arrows would rain down on the English from above, coming down on their heads and shoulders, bypassing the protection of their shields. This was a deadly move. Men who had been safe behind the wall of shields were now vulnerable. It was during this barrage, according to the story immortalized in the Bayeux Tapestry, that fate intervened in the most dramatic way possible. An arrow, fired at a high angle, struck King Harold in the eye, mortally wounding him. The death of the king was the final, devastating blow to the English cause. With Harold fallen, the leadership and morale of the English army collapsed. The Bayeux Tapestry depicts a chaotic scene. One image shows a figure pulling an arrow from his eye, while another figure next to him is being cut down by a Norman knight. Some historians believe both figures represent Harold, showing first his wounding and then his death. Without their king to lead them, the remaining English soldiers lost their resolve. The disciplined shield wall finally disintegrated into small pockets of desperate men. The battle was effectively over. The last stand of the English was both heroic and tragic. Harold's loyal housecarls, refusing to flee, gathered around the body of their fallen king and fought to the death. They sold their lives dearly, fighting with a courage that even their Norman enemies admired. But their bravery was not enough. As darkness fell over the battlefield, the Normans overwhelmed the last pockets of resistance. William the Conqueror had won. He had defeated his rival and conquered a kingdom in a single day. The Anglo-Saxon age had ended in the blood and mud of a Sussex hillside with the death of its last English king. The Norman era had begun. The story of the Battle of Hastings that we are most familiar with today is largely the Norman version of events. After their victory, William the Conqueror and his supporters needed to legitimize their rule. They couldn't simply be seen as foreign invaders who had taken a kingdom by force. They needed to craft a narrative that portrayed William as the rightful king and Harold as a treacherous usurper. This was a sophisticated propaganda campaign, and its most famous artifact is the Bayeux Tapestry. This incredible piece of embroidery, likely commissioned by William's half-brother Bishop Odo, tells the story entirely from a Norman point of view. It is a masterpiece of political storytelling. The central pillar of the Norman claim was the alleged oath that Harold Godwinson swore to William. The tapestry depicts this event in great detail. It shows Harold in Normandy, placing his hands on two holy relic chests and swearing an oath of loyalty to Duke William. By breaking this sacred promise and taking the crown for himself, Harold was portrayed as a perjurer, a man who had not only betrayed William but had also defied God. This framing was crucial. It transformed William's invasion from an act of aggression into a holy crusade to punish a sinner and reclaim what was rightfully his. The Norman victory was presented as divine judgment, proof that God was on their side. The Norman chronicles, written by monks like William of Poitiers and Orderic Vitalis, further reinforced this narrative. These accounts consistently praise William's piety, wisdom, and military genius. They describe him as a just and merciful leader who was reluctant to go to war but was forced to do so by Harold's treachery. The battle itself is portrayed as a triumph of superior Norman tactics and divine favor over English brute force. The feigned retreat, for example, is presented as a stroke of tactical brilliance rather than a desperate measure or a fortunate accident. Every detail was carefully curated to support the idea that William's conquest was both legal and morally justified. This version of history was incredibly effective. It became the dominant narrative for centuries, shaping how future generations understood the events of 1066. The Normans built magnificent cathedrals and castles across England, physical symbols of their power and permanence. They replaced the English language with Norman French in the halls of power, and they rewrote the laws of the land. The story they told about their own arrival was an essential part of this process of conquest and assimilation. It was a story designed to make their rule seem inevitable and preordained, a tale of a rightful king claiming his promised inheritance from an unworthy and dishonest rival. The English perspective on the Battle of Hastings is much harder to find. After the Norman conquest, the English ruling class was decimated. Many nobles were killed in the fighting or lost their lands afterwards. The centers of learning and record-keeping, the monasteries, were soon taken over by Norman abbots. As a result, few English accounts of the battle survived, and those that did were often written years later, under the watchful eye of the new Norman rulers. To piece together the English side of the story, we must look for clues in the margins of history, reading between the lines of the dominant Norman narrative and examining later chronicles that preserved older oral traditions. From the English viewpoint, Harold Godwinson was no usurper. He was the chosen and legitimate King of England. His claim was based on the nomination by the dying King Edward the Confessor and his confirmation by the Witan, the Council of the Kingdom's most powerful men. This was the traditional Anglo-Saxon way of choosing a king. To the English, this was far more valid than a supposed promise made years earlier to a foreign duke. The oath that Harold may have sworn to William in Normandy was seen very differently. English sources, if they mention it at all, suggest that Harold was essentially a prisoner at the time, shipwrecked and under duress. Any oath made under such circumstances was not considered legally or morally binding. The battle itself was not seen as a tale of Norman brilliance, but as a story of English misfortune and exhaustion. Harold had just fought and won a major battle in the north, only to have to immediately march his tired army the length of the country to face a fresh enemy. The English fought with incredible bravery and discipline for an entire day, holding off a larger, more varied army. They were not defeated by superior tactics, but by sheer bad luck. The death of Harold, whether by a random arrow or in the final chaotic fighting, was a tragic accident that turned the tide of the battle at the very last moment. For the English, it was not a divine judgment, but a national catastrophe. The aftermath of the battle was a period of immense suffering for the English people. The Norman conquest was not a smooth transition of power, but a brutal military occupation. William faced numerous English rebellions in the years following 1066, and he crushed them with ruthless efficiency. His most notorious act was the Harrying of the North, a brutal campaign of destruction that laid waste to vast swathes of northern England, causing widespread famine and death. For the English who survived, the Norman victory was not a righteous triumph, but the beginning of a long, dark period of oppression by foreign lords who stole their land, dismantled their laws, and treated them as a conquered people. The story of the Battle of Hastings is more than just a dramatic tale of kings and warriors. It is a powerful lesson in how history is written and remembered. It reminds us that there is rarely a single, simple truth about the past. Instead, there are different versions of the story, each shaped by the perspective, biases, and motivations of the person telling it. The Norman account of 1066 is a story of justice, destiny, and divine will. The English account is one of betrayal, misfortune, and tragic heroism. Both contain elements of the truth, but neither tells the whole story. History is not just what happened, but who gets to tell the story of what happened. The concept of the battle being a fraud is a provocative one. It doesn't mean the fighting wasn't real or that the soldiers weren't brave. It points to the political deception that surrounded the entire event. Was William's claim to the throne legitimate, or was it a clever excuse for a land grab? Was Harold's oath a sacred vow, or was it an empty promise extracted under duress? Was the feigned retreat a brilliant tactic, or a lucky accident that was later glorified by Norman storytellers? By asking these questions, we learn to be critical consumers of historical narratives. We learn to look for the agenda behind the story and to question the official version of events. This event also teaches us about the profound and lasting impact of a single day. The Norman conquest didn't just change who wore the crown, it changed England forever. It introduced a new language, a new aristocracy, a new system of law, and a new style of architecture. The English language we speak today is a hybrid, a mixture of Anglo-Saxon and Norman French. The social structures and legal concepts that developed over the following centuries were all built on the foundation laid by William's victory. Understanding Hastings helps us understand the complex DNA of modern Britain. It shows how our present is inextricably linked to the events of the distant past. For young people, the most important lesson from the Battle of Hastings is the importance of empathy and perspective. By trying to understand the story from both William's and Harold's points of view, we can see that history is not a simple story of good guys versus bad guys. It is a complex drama with motivated, flawed human beings at its center. William was ambitious and ruthless, but he was also a strong leader. Harold was brave and popular, but he may have made a political miscalculation that cost him his kingdom. The story of 1066 is a timeless reminder that truth is often complex. History is written by the winners, and the echoes of a single battle can last for 1,000 years.